So while the Disney adaptation video didn't exactly take off like my fools hoped for it, reception was strong enough to confirm the continued interest in Kingdom Hearts content on this channel. So I've decided to dedicate some time to video ideas that are more substantial than my usual shorts, but not months of work level massive like that one was. So let's talk about two of my favorite things potentially crossing over. I know statistically I'm far from being alone in loving both KH and the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Despite the disparaging comments both are often met with, these are still both two of the biggest and most popular IPs in their respective mediums, and it's long been theorized that a Marvel world is bound to happen in KH. Prior to deciding on this video though, I've never given any serious consideration to what that might look like. The short answer to how I, the Ponderer, would bring Marvel into KH is I wouldn't. Much as I love it, heck, I'm a much bigger fan of the MCU than I am of KH, I don't think Marvel, or Star Wars for that matter, belong in Kingdom Hearts. I don't really consider them Disney the way that so much else in the franchise is, and my goal in doing this video is a self-imposed challenge of sorts. Can I earnestly come up with a setup for a Marvel world in KH4 that would satisfy someone of my mindset? And yes, this is going to be specifically for our imagined KH4. For this thought exercise, we're assuming that Sora is the main playable character and that we're working with PS5 hardware. Now, I think most people are like me in assuming that if this were to happen, it would take the form of a KH world adapting an MCU movie. And a big reason why I wouldn't want to see the MCU in KH is because it's such a massive franchise that trying to adapt any part of it beyond the broadest strokes feels like it's asking for the Marvel lore to overtake the KH lore. If you only adapt one movie or show in the MCU for KH, then it feels like a massive missed opportunity that you haven't touched the rest of it. But if you try to adapt multiple projects in one world, then you have so much material that you might as well adapt the Marvel stuff into its own whole game. You could just toss Sora into Endgame if you want something that feels like it encompasses the entire MCU, but that movie is a climax to a decade of storytelling and doesn't lend itself to being anyone's first foot into that realm, the way that every other Disney world in the series is typically pretty straightforward even if you've not seen the movie in question. Plus, even the PS5 would likely find rendering the final battle impossible, especially outside of FMV, and what's the point of even doing that movie without that fight? Alternatively, if we were being really brave, you could put Sora in Infinity War and have him ping-ponging between the movie's multiple plot lines. Infinity War is a more self-contained plot than it often gets credit for, so it wouldn't alienate newcomers as bad if Sora were to serve as the eyes into that story. And it would be a rare opportunity to have a Disney World end on a complete down note, with the assumption that you would then adapt Endgame in KH5 or something. But no, none of those feel quite right. What feels like the most viable option to me comes back to those two words, broad strokes. As a franchise so big in scope, I think the best way for KH4 to approach Marvel would actually be the same approach that KH1 and 2 took in adapting Final Fantasy. Which is to say, again, don't. Just like how the numerous Final Fantasy characters tended to show up in KH with very little care to their own canon, what I'm going to propose here is a Traverse Town or Hollow Bastion style world where a handful of otherwise disconnected MCU characters hang out, but where we're not really trying to adapt anything specific. This might seem like a cheat, or at the very least unsatisfying, and maybe it is. Lord knows I've seen some FF fans be displeased with how those characters come off in Kingdom Hearts, but this course gives us so much leeway to work with I genuinely can't see anything else giving us a better result. If Marvel takes the FF approach, we basically have our pick of heroic characters or settings, including mixing or matching people and plot points that have nothing to do with each other in the movies. Rather than usual for Disney worlds where there's a concerted effort to make characters visually identical to their film counterparts, I'd emphasize this approach we're taking by stylizing the MCU characters the same way we do the FF characters. Make the Avengers character designs a bit more simple and exaggerated visually. If nothing else, you can't tell me that you're not curious what a Nomura take on some of these character designs or costumes might be. But okay, visuals aside, if this is the way we're doing it, then we've still got to work out what the setting actually is, since I do still want it to be something unique to Marvel, what a broad story might be, and which Marvel characters we're specifically choosing for it. Hitting that first point first, coming up with a name for this world was surprisingly the hardest part of this whole experiment. Picking just one corner of the MCU to be the entire quote-unquote world feels like closing off too many future possibilities, but we went from the Pirates world being Port Royale in KH2 to the Caribbean in KH3, so screw it. The name of the world is Avengers Compound, and it will be comprised of the compound itself as well as two other major locations that we'll talk about later. Something I notice is that KH has managed to avoid any scenario where it might have to talk about Disney worlds where Disney characters might literally come from other realms or planets within one IP. That said, I don't want to do with this world what we do with, say, Wendy in KH1, where we quietly suggest that London is somehow part of Neverland. So, controversial though it may be, when picking characters for our Marvel world, I'm taking anyone classified as an alien off the board. So, no Thor, no Eternals, and no Guardians of the Galaxy. In the confines of this world, those guys will only get extremely minor visual references, if any reference at all. They might as well not exist, but if you really want to, you can imagine they're all off doing space stuff during Sora's visit. Heck, maybe we even lean way into the Final Fantasy comparison and have the spacefaring characters like Thor or Captain Marvel make Zack or Auron-style cameos outside of the confines of this Marvel world. I certainly don't want to do something like making Asgard or Xandar or Hala their own worlds within the game, cause that's officially oversaturating, so those guys are just gonna go. So we're keeping Sora's adventure to Earth, with Earth-based heroes and villains. For our main players though, I'm going to limit it to a group of at max 7 different Marvel heroes, making up our Avengers team. Some of these choices, I'll admit right now, are going to be a little arbitrary, and you can let me know in the comments which characters you would choose in this scenario. My choices? To start, I feel like Iron Man and Captain America are both a must. Despite not having appeared in nearly 5 years, Tony Stark is still the face of the MCU to a lot of people. People who would absolutely throw a fit if he didn't make an appearance here. It's probably the obvious choice to say that if we're doing a Final Fantasy-esque ensemble of characters, then Tony Stark should be our point man, our main connection for Sora into the events of the world, like Leon is for Hala Bastion or Traverse Town. Opposite that, if this group of characters Sora encounters is an Avengers team, and not just a bunch of random heroes, then we absolutely need a Captain America in the leadership position. Notice I said a Captain America, because I'm open to either Steve Rogers or Sam Wilson being the one who appears here. Next one I'd include is Black Widow, in part so that the team here is less of a boys' club, and in part because I've always viewed Black Widow in the MCU as a super interesting character and foil to Iron Man and Cap. Especially if the Captain America here is Steve Rogers, I'd love to lean into Natasha's role as the mediator between Steve and Tony, and maybe have Sora draw some internal comparisons between this trio of temperaments and himself, Kairi, and Riku. I'd want to include the Hulk. He's always been an interesting guy to have on the team, and you could also draw some parallels between Bruce Banner and Sora, who maybe has his own inner darkness to struggle against with the likes of Rage and Antiform. I know I'm interested in the idea of KH4 exploring Sora's inner darkness a bit more thoroughly than the previous games, and this would be a neat opportunity to tie it into one of the Disney stories. Now we get into some slight curveballs. I'd also include Shang-Chi and Ms. Marvel on the roster here. Why? Because I think they're cool and they would be fun to have around, and Ms. Marvel especially would have a fun dynamic with Sora, I think. I also think it's important to remember that Avengers Endgame will probably be 6 or 7 years old by the time that KH4 comes out, so I definitely want to give a major role to some post-Endgame characters. And lastly, at a stretch, either Scarlet Witch or Doctor Strange, just because it would be fun to have a mage around and possibly see Sora react to how magic users take a very different form in this world to what he's used to. Bonus points if you do something really cool, like have Sora learn a spell or an ability that specifically ties into Marvel's brand of sorcery or witchcraft. Imagine any of this stuff as a tier 3 KH spell. Oh, and feel free to disagree with me on this, but I think it's kinda important that Spider-Man not be one of our heroes here. Mainly just because I think it would be kinda weird to have an overtly MCU-inspired variant of the character in this game, while a very different version of Spidey is starring in his own games on the same hardware. But also because I think this is one of those contexts where Spidey's mere presence would overwhelm the rest of the cast, Sora included. He's a very, very rare breed of fictional character whose popularity and iconic nature doesn't quite complement Kingdom Hearts. You put him in this game and suddenly there's someone who completely dwarfs every other character in the franchise, except for maybe the mouse himself in terms of pop culture relevance. I don't like it. He's the kind of guy who can maybe have a background cameo or a brief one-off mention or something, like the other Earth-based heroes who I haven't mentioned. Put him and Ant-Man and Hawkeye and Vision on a poster or something, I don't know. So yeah, these guys are our Avengers, our Marvel take on the Hala Bastion Restoration Committee. And in that vein, I'd probably also do something similar to what KH2 does with those guys just prior to the Battle of 1,000 Heartless. By that I mean the way I integrate the Avengers into gameplay is by having some kind of extended sequence where you fight alongside every member of the team, without technically adding any of them to the party. They'll fight alongside Sora-like party members and do damage to Heartless and whatnot, but if they have health bars, then they'll be invisible. And you won't spend more than a couple minutes of gameplay at a time fighting alongside the same one or two team members. Maybe on top of or in place of that, you could have an assortment of KH3 style action commands or team attacks available throughout the world, which would cycle through Avengers members for Sora to pull off a tandem move with. I think that's a good compromise in place of having to select one or two members to be official party members, and it's a sure sight better than having a whole team of characters around who never contribute anything in gameplay like Big Hero 6. But that's enough priming the heroes. Who's gonna be our villain? For the sake of simplicity, I'm really tempted to go even further with the Hollow Bastion comparisons, and have it so the villains of this world are just whoever happens to be the villain of the game's central plot. The fact that Hollow Bastion's main villains, for lack of a better descriptor, were Organization 13 and to a much lesser extent Maleficent, that helped the world feel very consequential. I know I want a similar sort of feeling, at the very least have a sort of KH3 approach where the central plot baddies have some kind of stake in this world's story. But I'll speak more to that later, and I'm also always one to advocate leaning into each Disney world having a Disney villain for you to fight. So of course I'm gonna have to pick an MCU villain and build a story around them. So who am I picking? Ultron. Why Ultron? He's one of my favorite villains in the MCU, and with Sora on board, who's naturally kind of OP anyways, you definitely need an Avengers level threat to be the baddie here, and Ultron's one of the only ones of those to not come from space. He'd also be kind of a unique villain for Kingdom Hearts. We've had comedic or charismatic or snarky villains in these games before, like Hades or Xigbar, but Sora's never faced a villain as impulsive and borderline scatterbrained as Ultron. He'd actually make an interesting sort of primer for when Sora has to confront the Master of Masters, being another character who can bounce on a dime from nihilistic philosophizing to Machiavellian scheming to affable, casual observations and tangents. I'd love to see him exchange dialogue with Sora, his sardonic nihilism meeting Sora's completely earnest, hard-on-sleeve idealism. Heck, we've had villains effectively get under Sora's skin and make him question himself in the past. It would be gangbusters if Ultron hit Sora with the same "your defense of the status quo makes you a monster" screed that he laid at the Avengers in his movie. He could also make for a great boss fight, and his drones could be great goons alongside whatever Heartless the world has. Speaking of which, let's finally get into what the broad story of this world might actually be. To start, I'm thinking Sora arrives at Avengers compound and meets one of the Avengers, probably Iron Man, fighting some Heartless. The two team up and make quick work of them before making a proper introduction, at which point Tony mentions that this was an especially bad day to have a monster infestation, since they're also fighting off Ultron, who's in the middle of assaulting the compound. I'd want it to be clear as we go that Ultron is an enemy the Avengers have faced before, perhaps many times. Another way of making it clear that we are not strictly translating or adhering to any of the movie's continuity. The team and Ultron speak to each other with familiarity, and it's clear that Sora isn't happening upon their first clash. Have Tony lead Sora through the compound, and as you go through, you encounter different team members fighting off hordes of Ultron drones in different rooms. It would probably be smoothest to have Sora meet the rest of the team in pairs, so pick two members and have them be fighting together when Sora arrives, with quick mid-fight introductions made before all parties converge in one room to fight off both Ultron drones and Heartless. After this stretch of gameplay, we should get some brief downtime for Sora to fully ingratiate himself to the team. Maybe Ultron decides to retreat in order to forge some more drones or further his mysterious plans off-screen. We can maybe have an interesting discussion about whether Ultron has a heart or not. Maybe he's developed one through sheer willpower, and the darkness in it is what called the Heartless to this world. I don't know, that's an idea to be fleshed out by someone with more time than me. Either way, the team eventually decides to seek Ultron out and stop him for good, and they do so on the world's next big location, the Helicarrier. Now, my first instinct is to have it so the Ultron drones are still a threat somehow, even in this section of the world, but in ironing this idea out, the Helicarrier is basically going to serve as Act 2 of the world. And I maybe want the player to have a break from Ultron of sorts, since we just had a whole extended sequence fighting him, and he's understandably going to be a big part of Act 3. Ultron is a big character who soaks up a lot of attention whenever he's actually on screen, and I don't want him overwhelming or distracting from the Avengers themselves, so barring maybe a cutscene or two near the end of this sequence where he hijacks the Helicarrier remotely or something, this is the stretch of the world where Ultron takes a backseat and the Heartless are front and center. As of right now, none of us really know how the Kingdom Hearts original villains are going to make their presence known in the Disney worlds, but I have to assume that like Kingdom Hearts 2 and 3, they'll make some kind of appearance to influence or even just observe Sora on his journey. All that to say that the Helicarrier will also be where that happens. So insert cryptic appearance from the Master of Masters or the Foretellers or whoever, as the heroes put the hunt for Ultron on a brief pause to kick these strangers and the invading Heartless off their ship. If this is specifically the Master of Masters or one of the Foretellers we're dealing with, then what I'd love is if their stake in the story was to provide a kind of philosophical counterpart to Ultron. If it's the Foretellers, characters who were doggedly determined to maintain their sense of peace and sameness in back cover and Union Cross, then we could have them be advocates for the status quo, arguing that the worlds have changed too much, that we need to move backwards, that figures like Ultron are fools, and have them encourage Sora in tandem with Ultron criticizing him. Again, we have no clue what the actual scheme is or will be with these guys, but based on where we've left them in the past, I think it's natural to infer that Sora has some kind of role that they're aware of, and we should lean all the way into their nature as adhering to their own roles. They should be pushing Sora to keep doing whatever it is he's doing, as it will inevitably play into their master's hands. What they assume must ultimately be in the interest of restoring their status quo. KH has never really done that before, have two villain factions in one world who are opposed not just physically but philosophically. If by some very unlikely chance it's the Master of Masters himself here, he can be more of a complement to Ultron than a contrast. We know, or can at least infer, that MOM is much more interested in sweeping change than his students, even if it absolutely wrecks lives, another big thing he and Ultron have in common. Again though, Mom can differ from Ultron by encouraging Sora on his path, having his long-term plans which would benefit from staying on Sora's good side, or at least ensuring he stays on a certain path. Regardless of who it is, their encouragement should give Sora hesitance, and maybe even make him consider if there's some mild validity to Ultron's ideals. Maybe it's the Avengers themselves who afterwards can restore some of Sora's conviction by being a happy philosophical medium between the two villainous extremes. By the end of the world, Sora should have internalized some small sense of doubt about what he's doing over the course of the game and why. Of course, it wouldn't be a helicarrier if it didn't crash, so this is where I'd actually pseudo-adapt another sequence from an Avengers movie. This time, I'd pull from the first film by having the bad guys unleash a rogue Hulk on the helicarrier. The way I'd execute this is by having it so Bruce Banner stays in human form when the team leaves the compound. Have him be the one who focuses on tracking Ultron while Sora and the others fight the Heartless. That means for this stretch of the game, the Hulk is unavailable for fighting alongside Sora or for team moves. Then, just when the fighting is winding down, the Heartless or Ultron or somebody does something that triggers Bruce into a classic Hulk rage, and we get a Sora vs. Hulk boss fight. Yeah, sorry, if you tell me that we're putting Marvel in KH and Sora doesn't get to fight one of the heroes, then what are we even doing here? And honestly, the mind runs wild with possibilities here. I'm mainly thinking a 1v1 where Hulk is just this complete beast who's mainly only susceptible to magic. So naturally, Sora and co beat Hulk back into lucidity, but in the process, the helicarrier takes so much damage that it starts to crash towards Ultron's location. Maybe the crash itself could be its own cool Uncharted-esque gameplay sequence, where you're avoiding debris and using reaction commands or QuickTime events to save some of the less survivable members of the team. I don't know, but either way, the whole team naturally survives the crash. The player and Sora won't be sure of that immediately though, since they'll have woken up isolated in some wreckage. As we break out of the wreckage, we discover where we've landed, which brings us to our third location, Sokovia. Yeah, I know I said we're not straightforwardly adapting the movies, but I thought about it, and not only would it be interesting to have Sora visit a dilapidated but still populated place like Sokovia, it also just feels like the most natural place to climax. The other natural choice was obviously New York City, but not only would I not want to risk another big urban population center that might feel too similar to San Francisco or Quadratum, I also live in New York and wouldn't want to risk accidentally dropping a helicarrier on my own house. Honestly, in terms of sheer vibes, the closest thing that I want to get to here is actually KH3 Olympus. And it might even be cool to have some sequences like in that world that are dedicated to saving civilians. So yeah, for all that we're fudging and twisting the MCU continuity, Ultron specifically invading Sokovia is, I suppose, good as a broad plot beat to remind you that it is in fact the movies that we're pulling inspiration from. If you want, he can even have the same plan of blasting the city into the air and then bringing it down like a meteor. Though since the helicarrier is freshly out of commission and we obviously want to be able to revisit this place, he can't make it as far into that plan as he did in the movie. It's pretty straightforward from there. The team fights throughout the city, eventually Ultron and all his copies go down, squeeze in and Avengers assemble before we're out, and maybe Sora gets made an honorary Avenger when all is said and done. In one of the few moments where I actually want to directly send up the movies, I would end the conflict by giving Sora and Ultron a final exchange akin to the one Ultron has with Vision in the film. Have Sora be the recipient of this line,
"You're Bearably naive.
And honestly, the more I think out this hypothetical, the more that broadly retelling Age of Ultron but with Sora in place of Vision strikes me as a truly ingenious prospect. And hey, you know what? One more idea on the way out. After you beat this world, make Miss Marvel the summon or Link or whatever. Anyway, yeah, I think I've got something good here. I don't know if it comes through in the way this is written, but this idea became something very different by the end than what I went into it planning to make. It was definitely a compelling challenge to meet, and while it's possible my bias in favor of Age of Ultron as a movie comes through in my choices here, I hope I communicated just how many of these decisions were made from a practical standpoint. If you like what I've conceived here, let me know, and if you have reservations, tell me about those too. Either way, if you've made it this far, leave a like and subscribe. If this video does well, I'll do a follow-up for other Disney or Disney-adjacent movies and how I'd integrate them into Kingdom Hearts if I had to. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the future.